Welcome to the audiobook summary of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. In this journey, we'll explore the workings of the human mind, guided by two key systems of thinking, one that is fast, instinctive, and emotional, and another that is slow, deliberate, and logical. This book is more than just a collection of ideas. It's a deep dive into how we make decisions, why we sometimes fail, and what we can do to improve our thinking. Whether you're here to sharpen your decision-making skills, understand your thought processes better, or just out of curiosity, you're in the right place. Throughout this audiobook, I'll take you through the core concepts, breaking them down into digestible insights. We'll walk through the building blocks of human cognition, the shortcuts our minds take, and how these shortcuts sometimes lead us astray. Together, we'll examine the science of decision-making, revealing practical tools to help you in everyday life, whether at work, in relationships, or during moments of personal reflection. So sit back, relax, and let's explore the fascinating world of thinking fast and slow. Get ready to uncover the hidden forces that shape your thoughts, your choices, and your life. Part 1. Two systems. In this section, we are introduced to the two core systems that shape the way we think and make decisions. Kahneman describes these as System 1 and System 2, and they form the foundation for much of what follows in the book. System 1 is fast, automatic, and instinctive. It operates with little effort, making quick judgments based on patterns, experiences, and associations. Think of System 1 as your brain's autopilot. It's always active and constantly interpreting the world around you without you even noticing. On the other hand, System 2 is slow, deliberate, and analytical. This is the part of your brain that engages when you need to think carefully about a problem, solve a puzzle, or make a difficult decision. It requires effort and concentration. Unlike System 1, System 2 doesn't jump to conclusions. Instead, it carefully analyzes situations before making a decision. One way to think about these systems is to imagine walking into a room and instantly recognizing a familiar face. That's System 1 in action. It happens without any effort on your part. But if you were asked to solve a math problem, say 17 times 24, you would need to stop and focus. This is System 2 taking over. Let's look at a story that reflects the dynamic between these two systems. Picture yourself driving a familiar route home from work. You've driven this route so many times that you barely even think about it anymore. System 1 takes care of everything. You're on autopilot and your mind might even wander off to other thoughts. But suddenly, traffic comes to a halt because of an accident up ahead. Now you need to navigate around the traffic jam, and you become much more alert and focused. System 2 kicks in to help you solve this unexpected problem. This constant interaction between System 1 and System 2 is happening every day in your life. While System 1 makes many tasks effortless, its tendency to rely on assumptions and quick judgments can also lead to errors, what Kahneman calls cognitive biases. These biases arise because System 1 often jumps to conclusions too quickly, based on incomplete or misleading information. It's fascinating to realize that much of what we consider thinking happens almost automatically. We often believe we're being rational, when in fact, we're relying on these fast, automatic processes. System 2, while slower, helps us correct mistakes when we give it the chance. But it's mentally tiring, which is why we tend to avoid using it when possible. As Kahneman explores in this part of the book, the interaction between these two systems has profound implications for everything, from how we make everyday decisions to how we respond to complex situations in life. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both systems can help us become more aware of our own thought processes and avoid some of the traps our minds set for us. In part 1, Kahneman also explores key concepts such as attention and effort, showing us that System 2 requires significant mental energy. When we're tired or distracted, we tend to lean even more on System 1, which can make us prone to errors in judgment. He introduces us to ideas like cognitive ease, the comfort we feel when things are easy for our brains to process. This comfort, however, can sometimes be misleading. Kahneman also discusses how associative thinking in System 1 leads to heuristics, mental shortcuts that can be helpful but are often flawed. These heuristics make it possible for us to make quick decisions without too much effort, but they also open the door to biases and mistakes. To put it simply, part 1 lays the groundwork for understanding how these two systems govern our thinking. It gives us the tools to recognize when we might be relying too much on System 1 and when we need to activate System 2 for better, more deliberate decisions. As we move forward into the next sections of the book, keep in mind these two systems. They'll help us unpack many of the biases and patterns of behavior that Kahneman explores throughout Thinking Fast and Slow. Understanding them is the first step toward improving how we think and make decisions in our daily lives. Now that we've laid the foundation with part 1, get ready to explore how these systems influence our judgments in the next section. We'll dive into the shortcuts our brains take and how they often lead us into heuristics and biases, which are not always as helpful as they seem. Stay with me as we continue this fascinating exploration of the human mind. Part 2, Heuristics and Biases. In this section, Daniel Kahneman shows us how our quick, intuitive thinking powered by System 1 can often lead us astray. While these mental shortcuts, or heuristics, are incredibly useful for making fast decisions, they also introduce systematic errors known as biases. Let's break this down. Heuristics are mental rules of thumb that we rely on to make decisions quickly and with minimal effort. They help us simplify complex problems by using past experiences, patterns, and associations. In many cases, these shortcuts work well, like when we make quick judgments about whether we trust someone, or when we estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily we can recall similar examples. However, heuristics can also be misleading, particularly when we're dealing with uncertain or complex situations. Kahneman introduces us to several types of heuristics in this part of the book, and he explains how they lead to common biases, systematic errors in judgment. Let's explore a few of the most important ones. One of the first heuristics Kahneman describes is the availability heuristic. This is when we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. For instance, after hearing about a plane crash on the news, people tend to overestimate the danger of air travel, even though statistically it remains much safer than driving. The more easily we can recall an example of something, the more we think it happens frequently. Another key heuristic is anchoring. This occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making decisions. For example, if you're negotiating the price of a car and the seller mentions a high starting price, this number will influence your counteroffer even if it's unreasonable. Your brain anchors to that first figure and everything afterward is judged relative to it. The representativeness heuristic is another common mental shortcut. It leads us to make judgments based on how similar something is to a stereotype or model we've constructed in our minds. For example, if you hear about someone who is quiet, thoughtful, and likes to read, you might automatically assume they are a librarian, even though statistically they are far more likely to have another profession. This heuristic leads us to ignore important statistical realities in favor of what seems typical or representative. Kahneman also explores a powerful bias known as overconfidence. Humans, it turns out, are often much more confident in their judgments and predictions accuracy would justify. We tend to believe that we know more than we do, or that the future is more predictable than it really is. This bias is particularly dangerous because it can lead to poor decisions in everything from personal finances to public policy. What's particularly interesting is how these biases aren't limited to isolated incidents. They're deeply ingrained in our thinking. In fact, they shape our judgments and decisions all the time, often without us even realizing it. Think about a time when you made a snap decision that seemed right at the moment but didn't turn out well. Chances are one of these biases played a role. Perhaps you overestimated how likely something was because it was easy to recall from memory. Or you were influenced by an initial number thrown into a conversation, which anchored your thinking. It's important to recognize that we all fall prey to these biases, no matter how intelligent or rational we believe we are. Part of Kahneman's mission in this section of the book is to make us aware of these tendencies, so we can catch ourselves in the act and make better decisions. Understanding heuristics and biases is like learning to see the hidden wiring in our decision-making processes. It's not about being perfect, it's about being aware. By identifying when we're relying too much on System 1 and recognizing when a decision might need more deliberate, careful thought from System 2, we can improve the way we approach problems, big or small. In Part 2, Kahneman gives us tools to better understand our own minds and offers us insights into the common traps of thinking that can lead us to faulty conclusions. As we move forward in the book, these concepts will continue to play a critical role in how we analyze and make decisions. Next, in Part 3, we'll delve deeper into the overconfidence we discussed here and explore why we tend to believe that we understand the world better than we actually do. Get ready to uncover the illusions that often blind us to the truth in the world around us. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Thinking Fast and Slow. Part 3, Overconfidence. Welcome to Part 3 of Thinking Fast and Slow, where we take a closer look at one of the most pervasive and potentially dangerous biases in human judgment, overconfidence. In this section, Daniel Kahneman explores the illusion of certainty that often clouds our thinking and decision-making. He shows us how we tend to overestimate our knowledge, our ability to predict outcomes, and our understanding of the world around us. Overconfidence is not just about thinking we're better at something than we actually are. It's about believing we understand more than we do. This bias affects everyone, from individuals making personal choices to experts offering predictions in fields like finance, politics, and beyond. Kahneman reveals how this overconfidence can lead to serious errors in judgment, resulting in everything from failed business ventures to poor investment decisions. One of the first concepts Kahneman introduces in this part is the illusion of understanding. This is the belief that we understand the causes of events when, in reality, the world is far more complex and unpredictable than we think. We tend to create neat stories after the fact, explaining outcomes as if they were inevitable, when, in truth, they were often shaped by random factors we couldn't have predicted. Take, for example, the stock market. When stocks rise or fall, we often hear explanations that seem perfectly reasonable. Analysts might say that a particular event like a political announcement or an economic report caused the market to move. These explanations make it sound as if the outcome was predictable. But in reality, markets are influenced by a complex web of factors, many of which are impossible to foresee. Kahneman calls this tendency hindsight bias, the I knew it all along effect. After something happens, we look back and convince ourselves that we could have predicted it. But the truth is, the future is full of uncertainty, and much of what happens is driven by chance. Our belief that we could have known what was going to happen is often just an illusion. Another important idea in this section is the illusion of validity. This is the mistaken belief that the more information we have, the more accurate our predictions will be. But Kahneman shows us that even when we have a lot of information, it doesn't necessarily improve our ability to forecast the future. In fact, too much information can sometimes lead to worse decisions, as we become overconfident in our ability to interpret that data. For instance, think about experts making predictions about the economy or elections. Despite having access to vast amounts of data, these predictions are often no more accurate than simple models or even random guesses. Yet, the experts themselves and the people who rely on them often believe these predictions are reliable, which is a classic case of the illusion of validity. It's humbling to realize how often we overestimate our knowledge and understanding. Think about a time when you felt confident about a decision, whether it was a financial investment, a career move, or even something as simple as guessing the outcome of a sports event, only to find out later that the outcome was completely different than you expected. In moments like these, it's easy to see how overconfidence can blind us to the complexity and unpredictability of the world. Kahneman also explores the limits of expert intuition. He questions the idea that experts in fields like finance or politics can consistently make accurate predictions. While experience and intuition can be valuable in some situations, such as when a firefighter instinctively senses danger, they are often unreliable in environments that are complex and unpredictable. The future, Kahneman reminds us, is often much less predictable than we think, and overconfidence in our ability to foresee it can lead to poor decisions. One of the most important takeaways from this section is the value of humility in decision-making. Kahneman encourages us to recognize the limits of our knowledge and to be wary of overconfidence, especially when dealing with uncertainty. Instead of relying on gut feelings or the advice of overconfident experts, we should focus on data, evidence, and well-thought-out models that can help us make better choices. We all want to feel certain about our decisions and the future, but Part 3 reminds us that embracing uncertainty and acknowledging the limits of our understanding can lead to better outcomes. It's not about abandoning confidence altogether, but about balancing it with caution and a clear-eyed view of the world's unpredictability. As we wrap up Part 3, Kahneman leaves us with a powerful message. Overconfidence can be dangerous, but recognizing its role in our thinking gives us a better chance of making wiser decisions. In the next section, we'll dive into choices, how we make them, how we perceive risk, and the ways in which our biases shape the decisions we make every day. Part 4, Choices. In this section, Daniel Kahneman shifts the focus to choices, exploring how we make decisions, particularly when faced with risk and uncertainty. Here, Kahneman introduces us to some of his most influential work, including prospect theory, a groundbreaking theory that earned him the Nobel Prize in economic sciences. At the heart of Part 4 is the idea that our decisions are not always rational or logical, even though we like to think they are. Instead, we are influenced by how choices are framed, by our emotions, and by biases that shape our perception of risk and reward. One of the central ideas Kahneman presents is the prospect theory, which challenges traditional economic models that assume people are rational decision makers. Prospect theory shows that we don't evaluate outcomes based on their final states. Rather, we evaluate them in terms of gains and losses relative to a reference point, often our current situation. Interestingly, losses loom larger than gains in our minds. This phenomenon is called loss aversion. Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky discovered that people are more sensitive to losses than to gains of the same size. For instance, the pain of losing $100 is much stronger than the pleasure of gaining $100. This bias can lead us to make choices that are more about avoiding losses than about seeking gains. even when the potential benefits outweigh the risks. This explains why people are often reluctant to sell losing investments, fearing the loss more than valuing the potential to reinvest in something better. It's also why we might prefer the safety of a guaranteed outcome, even if the potential upside of a riskier option could be significantly greater. Loss aversion is deeply rooted in human psychology and impacts everything from financial decisions to personal relationships. Another key concept Kahneman explores is the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes. This pattern shows that our behavior changes depending on whether we are dealing with gains or losses, and whether the probabilities of those outcomes are high or low. Here's how it works. When faced with a high probability of a gain, people tend to be risk-averse. They prefer a sure thing over a gamble, even if the gamble might offer a higher payoff. When faced with a high probability of a loss, people become risk-seeking. They'll take a chance to avoid the loss, even if it means risking more. When faced with a low probability of a gain, people tend to be risk-seeking. They're willing to gamble for the small chance of a big win, like buying a lottery ticket. And when faced with a low probability of a loss, people are risk-averse. They'll pay for insurance to avoid the small chance of a large loss. This fourfold pattern explains why we might buy insurance to protect against unlikely disasters, but also play the lottery despite the low odds of winning. It highlights how our attitudes toward risk are not consistent. They shift based on the context of the decision. It's fascinating to recognize how often our choices are shaped by these biases. We tend to think of ourselves as rational decision makers, but Kahneman's research shows that our preferences and actions are influenced by deeply ingrained psychological tendencies. Whether we are avoiding losses, gambling on unlikely gains, or seeking certainty, our decisions are often more emotional than logical. Kahneman also introduces the concept of framing effects. This is the idea that the way choices are presented or framed has a significant impact on the decisions we make. For example, people might react very differently to a surgery that has a 90% survival rate versus one that has a 10% mortality rate, even though both descriptions refer to the same odds. The framing of the information affects how we perceive the risk, leading us to make different choices depending on how it is presented. This insight has profound implications for many fields, from marketing to public policy. By understanding framing effects, we can better appreciate how subtle changes in wording or context can influence our decisions. Imagine a health campaign promoting a vaccination. If the campaign says the vaccine saves 95 out of every 100 people, it's likely to be much more persuasive than if it says 5 out of 100 people die. Without it, even though both statements are true, the power of framing can significantly alter public perception and behavior. In addition to these concepts, Kahneman explores how people mentally keep score when making decisions. He explains that we have a tendency to evaluate our outcomes relative to our expectations or to others' outcomes, rather than absolute terms. This can lead us to feel dissatisfied even when we have made a good decision, simply because we perceive that someone else has done better. This mental accounting impacts everything from our financial decisions to our feelings of happiness and satisfaction. Part 4 of Thinking Fast and Slow challenges us to reflect on how we make choices, especially when risk is involved. It reveals how our aversion to loss, our shifting attitudes toward risk, and the framing of information can all heavily influence our decisions, often in ways we don't fully recognize. By understanding these patterns, we can start to make better, more informed choices in our daily lives. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore two selves, how the way we experience life and how we remember it differ in surprising ways. Stay with me as we continue to uncover the fascinating insights of thinking fast and slow. Part 5, Two Selves. Welcome to Part 5 of Thinking Fast and Slow, where Daniel Kahneman introduces us to the concept of the two selves. In this final part of the book, Kahneman explores the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self, revealing how these two selves influence our perception of happiness and satisfaction. Let's start by understanding what Kahneman means by the experiencing self and the remembering self. It's the self that feels emotions, sensations, and reactions in real time. Whether you're savoring a delicious meal, feeling joy while spending time with loved ones, or enduring pain during a difficult experience, the experiencing self lives moment to moment and focuses on the now. On the other hand, the remembering self is the part of you that looks back and recalls past experiences. This self isn't concerned with every individual moment you've lived through. Instead, it focuses on key moments, particularly the highs and lows of an experience, as well as how it ended. The remembering self constructs the narrative of your life, creating the stories you tell yourself and others about what has happened to you. Here's a fascinating discovery Kahneman reveals. These two selves often have very different perceptions of the same event. For example, you could have an overall pleasant vacation with one particularly stressful day at the end. Your experiencing self might have enjoyed 90% of the trip, but your remembering self will focus more on that bad day and the way the vacation concluded. As a result, when asked about the trip later, you might describe it in a more negative light than how you actually felt during the majority of the experience. This distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self has profound implications for how we understand happiness. It challenges the way we measure well-being. Are we happier in the moments of our lives, or in how we look back and remember them? More often than not, we let the remembering self take control, allowing it to define how we feel about our past, even though it might not always be the most accurate reflection of our actual experiences. Kahneman uses a powerful analogy to explain this difference. He compares it to a person listening to a symphony. Imagine you're enjoying a beautiful symphony for an hour, but in the final moments, there's a loud screech that ruins the ending. Your experiencing self enjoyed almost the entire performance, but your remembering self might say the whole thing was spoiled because of that bad ending. This is how the remembering self often hijacks our overall view of an experience. One of the key points Kahneman makes in Part 5 is that the remembering self often wins out when we make decisions about our lives. For example, when we plan future vacations or decide on significant life events, we tend to prioritize the things that will make our remembering self happy, even if it's at the expense of our experiencing self. We might endure stressful, uncomfortable situations because we believe they'll lead to a story worth telling or a memorable achievement. This creates an interesting paradox. We may end up doing things that don't make us happy in the moment, but are chosen because we think they'll make us feel satisfied when we look back on them. Kahneman describes this as a disconnect between what we actually feel in our lives and how we later remember and interpret those feelings. Think about it. How often do we prioritize experiences that we know will be challenging or uncomfortable in the moment because we believe they'll be worth it in the long run? It's like running a marathon grueling in the moment, but often remembered as a proud achievement that enhances our life story. This is the influence of the remembering self in action. Kahneman also introduces the idea of duration neglect, which is the tendency of the remembering self to ignore the duration of an experience and instead focus on the quality of key moments and the ending. Whether an event lasted a few minutes or several hours, the remembering self only really cares about the peak moments and how things wrapped up. This explains why short but intense experiences, like a brief exhilarating thrill, can sometimes leave a stronger impression than longer but less memorable experiences. Kahneman encourages us to think critically about the balance between these two selves. If we want to improve our overall happiness, it's important to recognize the tension between living in the moment and creating memories for the future. Should we focus more on enhancing the present experience for our experiencing self? Or should we aim for memorable stories that will satisfy our remembering self? One of the most valuable takeaways from this section is the realization that our decisions are happiness, and even our perception of life are shaped by which self is in control at any given time. By becoming more aware of this dynamic, we can make better choices, ones that align more closely with what will truly bring us joy, both in the present and in the stories we will later tell ourselves. As we wrap up part 5, Kahneman leaves us with a profound insight. The stories we remember may not always reflect the full reality of our experiences. By understanding the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self, we can make more informed choices about how we live our lives and how we seek happiness. This section offers a powerful reminder that our perception of happiness is complicated. It's shaped by both the moments we live through and the memories we carry forward. To live a fulfilling life, perhaps the key is finding a balance between these two selves. As we conclude our journey through Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, we've uncovered a profound understanding of how our minds work, how we think, how we decide, and how we experience life. Kahneman has taken us deep into the mechanics of our cognition, showing us that the mind is not always as rational or predictable as we may believe. We began by meeting the two key characters of our story, System 1 and System 2. These two systems govern how we think, System 1 being fast, automatic, and intuitive, while System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. Throughout the book, we've seen how these systems influence our decisions, often in ways we don't consciously recognize. From heuristics and biases, the mental shortcuts that save us time but sometimes lead us astray, to the dangerous effects of overconfidence. Kahneman has highlighted the many ways our thinking can be biased or flawed. We learned how we often rely on our intuition and gut feelings, even when the situation calls for more careful, analytical thinking. In exploring choices, we discovered how our perception of risk is often skewed by loss aversion and how we make decisions based on the framing of information rather than objective facts. Kahneman's prospect theory showed us that humans are not purely rational creatures, and that our decisions are shaped by emotions, biases, and our desire to avoid losses more than we seek gains. Finally, in the section on the two selves, we explored the fascinating dynamic between the experiencing self and the remembering self. This understanding has given us a new perspective on how we interpret happiness, highlighting the tension between living in the moment and creating memories that shape how we view our lives in hindsight. At the heart of this book is a powerful message. Our minds are complex, and while they are capable of extraordinary things, they are also prone to systematic errors. By becoming more aware of these mental processes, by recognizing when we are relying on our fast but fallible System 1, or when we should engage the more effortful but accurate System 2, we can make better decisions, avoid common pitfalls, and ultimately lead more fulfilling lives. What Thinking Fast and Slow teaches us is that self-awareness is key. Understanding the ways in which our thinking can be biased or flawed doesn't just help us make better decisions. It helps us become more compassionate with ourselves and others. We are all subject to the same cognitive patterns, and recognizing them is the first step towards improving them. Thank you for joining me on this enlightening journey through Thinking Fast and Slow. It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you, and I hope you've gained valuable insights into your own thinking, decision-making, and understanding of life. Remember, the next time you face a decision, big or small, Take a moment to reflect on the systems at play. Engage your System 2 when needed, but don't be too hard on yourself when System 1 tries to take over. We are all learning, growing, and becoming better thinkers with each new experience. Until we meet again, I wish you all the best on your journey of self-discovery and thoughtful decision-making. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our next adventure together. Take care, and see you again soon.